Welcome to our deep dive on Socrates, the philosopher who really kind of changed Western thought. Journey back to ancient Athens with us, and we'll uncover his story and look at why he still matters all these years later.
I know it's really incredible how someone from, over 2,000 years ago can still be sparking conversations and debates even today.
It really is, right? And to get the full picture, we're going to be using a bunch of different sources for this deep dive. We have a biography, historical accounts, even some mythology thrown in there. It'll be part history, part philosophy, and hopefully all fascinating. And here's the thing about Socrates, though. He never wrote anything down himself. So we're relying completely on what other people said about him.
It's like you're trying to piece together a friend's personality, but only based on stories that you hear from their family, their coworkers, and that one ex that they just won't stop talking about.
Yeah, that's a pretty good analogy.
I like that.
So our main witnesses for this deep dive are going to be Aristophanes. He was a playwright who actually made fun of Socrates in his comedies. Yeah. We're also going to look at Plato-Socrates' dedicated student who wrote tons and tons about him.
Yeah.
And then there's Xenophon, a historian and friend who maybe had a more grounded view of Socrates than the others.
Yeah, each perspective is valuable in its own way, but it definitely makes it harder to figure out what's fact and what's fiction when it comes to Socrates.
Yeah, you're right about that. Okay, so our first challenge then is figuring out who Socrates actually was.
Yeah.
But to do that, we need to understand the world that he lived in. I mean, he was living during the golden age of Athens, a time known for cultural and intellectual achievements like crazy.
Yeah.
So they had this concept of democracy, but it wasn't exactly what we think of today.
Right. It was a society with a really strict social hierarchy where being skilled in the military was considered one of the most important virtues, and same-sex relationships were completely accepted, really different from what came later in Western society.
Wow, that's quite the picture. And right smack in the middle of this society, we have Socrates himself, this man who's been described as being, well, not really conventionally attractive.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just say he resembled a satyr a bit. And he was married to Xanthippe, a woman who was known for having a very sharp tongue.
Oh, and there's even a story about her throwing water on him. It just goes to show that even these great philosophers, they have their everyday kind of moments.
I love those little details. But what's interesting to me is that Socrates seemed to tolerate her strong personality pretty well, which was really different from how Athenian men typically viewed women. It makes you think about how he challenged norms in every aspect of his life, even his personal life.
It definitely shows that he wasn't afraid to be different. And that difference really comes through when you look at his approach to philosophy. Before Socrates, philosophers were mostly concerned with the cosmos, with the universe, and how it all worked.
So they were looking outward at the grand scheme of things.
Exactly. But Socrates decided to shift that focus inward. He wanted to look at humans, their ethics, politics, how we gain knowledge. It's like philosophy went through its own Copernican revolution, moving from the universe to the individual as the center of inquiry.
Wow, that is a major shift. And this new focus actually brought him into conflict with the sophists. They were these teachers who really valued winning arguments over finding the actual truth.
Right. The sophists were masters of rhetoric. They'd use clever wordplay and arguments to persuade people. But Socrates was interested in a much deeper kind of dialogue, a real search for understanding. He didn't care about winning. He just wanted to uncover the truth.
And that's where his famous method comes in, the Socratic Method. And you might be wondering, how does this apply to me today?
Yeah.
Think about how often we just kind of accept things at face value. The Socratic Method reminds us that we should be constantly questioning our assumptions and digging deeper and engaging in, thoughtful dialogue to really get to the heart of things.
Absolutely. It was about working together to find knowledge, not battling it out to see who could outsmart the other. Picture yourself actually being questioned by Socrates. He'd start with something simple, something like, what is justice? Or what is courage?
I'm already feeling like I'm on the spot just thinking about it.
Well, that's kind of the point. He would keep pressing you for a definition, exposing inconsistencies and challenging those assumptions. This whole process was called refutation, and it forced people to really confront their own biases and their own, flawed thinking. He'd also use irony sometimes, pretending to be ignorant, just to reveal how arrogant or intellectually lazy the other person was.
So it wasn't just about asking the questions. It was about how he asked them, pushing people to think critically and discover those truths within themselves.
You got it. He had a name for this whole process too, maieudex, which, if you look at the Greek, it literally means midwifery. He saw himself as a philosophical midwife, helping people give birth to the knowledge that was already inside them.
That is such a powerful image. But it also makes me wonder, what did Socrates actually believe? What were his core ideas?
Well, one of his most radical ideas was this. Virtue is knowledge. He actually believed that when people do bad things, it's because they don't actually understand what's good, not because they're inherently bad people.
Okay, but doesn't that imply that criminals are just, misinformed? It's hard to believe that no one is actually malicious.
I get where you're coming from, but for Socrates, the key was in really understanding what true goodness actually is. He believed that if we truly knew what was good, we would naturally choose it.
So in his mind, happiness wasn't about wealth or just fleeting pleasure. It was about aligning your life with virtue.
That's it. True happiness, or what the Greeks called eudaimonia, meant living a life guided by knowledge and virtue, not by stuff or selfish desires. And this led him to another famous idea. It is better to suffer wrong than to do wrong. He truly believed that staying true to your morals was the most important thing, even more important than fighting injustice.
Yeah, that reminds me of how he ultimately chose death over betraying his principles. He really did live what he believed. And speaking of living a virtuous life, he really stressed the importance of enkratia, which is all about self-control.
That's right. Enkratia is about mastering your desires and your passions. For Socrates, it was the path to true freedom, freedom from being controlled by your impulses.
So we see this emphasis on reason, virtue, and self-control. But things get a little murky when we start talking about his views on religion. He was actually accused of impiety, which suggests that his beliefs were pretty unconventional even for his time.
You're not wrong. His ideas about the divine definitely went against the grain. He believed in some kind of higher power that was beyond the traditional Greek gods and claimed to be guided by something he called a daemon, a sort of inner voice or spirit.
So is this daemon some kind of divine inspiration, a heightened sense of conscience, or something else entirely? It just adds another layer of mystery to this already super fascinating guy.
It really does. And all of this complexity is what makes studying Socrates so captivating.
Absolutely. But Socrates wasn't just some lone wolf with interesting ideas. He inspired whole schools of thought that tried to carry on his philosophical legacy.
And that's where we start to see the ripple effects of his thinking, shaping the entire course of Western philosophy. And those ripples, they're still impacting us even today.
And that's what we'll be diving into next. Stay tuned.
You know, it's really fascinating to see how all these different schools of thought popped up, all claiming to be inspired by Socrates. It just goes to show how multifaceted his legacy really is. Like, all these different seeds were planted and they grew in these diverse and unexpected ways.
So let's take a look at some of these philosophical gardens that sprouted from Socratic thought. We'll start with the Cyrenaics. They were founded by a guy named Aristippus of Cyrene. And they seem to have taken a pretty, let's call it a pleasure-focused approach to life.
Yeah, for sure. The Cyrenaics, just like Socrates, were all about figuring out how to live well. But they thought the ultimate good was to really maximize your immediate sensory pleasure, living fully in the moment, you know?
Oh, so kind of a carpe diem philosophy. But doesn't that sound a little bit excessive, maybe?
I think that's a common misunderstanding. The Cyrenaics weren't saying to just go wild and indulge in everything. They believed in a kind of mindful pleasure, appreciating the simple joys of what was right in front of you without constantly chasing after more and more stuff or desires.
That's interesting. Finding happiness in the now instead of always striving for something more. But it does seem pretty different from Socrates' emphasis on virtue and self-control.
It does, and it just goes to show how even people who really looked up to Socrates sometimes interpreted his ideas in their own way, creating these new schools of thought that kind of branched off from his original teachings.
Okay, so next up we have the Cynics. And I got to ask, the name comes from the Greek word for dog. Does that mean they were cynical?
Not quite in the way that we use the word cynical today. The Cynics were similar to Socrates in that they really believed in living a virtuous life. But they saw virtue as action, not knowledge. They were all about living in harmony with nature and rejecting all those artificial rules and desires that society tries to impose on us.
Oh, so they were kind of like ancient minimalists then, rejecting material wealth and status to live a more simple and authentic life.
Yeah, you could definitely say that. They believed that real happiness came from aligning yourself with the natural world and breaking free from all the corrupting influences of civilization. They thought things like wealth and fame were just distractions from finding the true path to virtue.
And they weren't afraid to put their money where their mouth was with their lifestyle choices. I mean, their most famous figure, Diogenes, actually lived in a barrel.
He did. Diogenes was like the poster child for Cynic philosophy. He rejected social norms left and right, challenged authority everywhere he went. He lived super simply, mocked anyone who was obsessed with material things, and basically spent his life trying to expose hypocrisy.
That guy was a true original. So we've got these smaller schools, the Cynics and the Cyrenaics, each taking their own spin on Socratic thought. But what about the big players that came later on in the Hellenistic period, like Stoicism and Epicureanism? How did they fit into this whole Socratic family tree?
Well, Stoicism and Epicureanism came about in a different historical context, but they were still wrestling with those big questions about virtue and how to live a good life. They both had this focus on ethics and provided guidance on how to deal with all the uncertainty and change that comes with being human.
Okay, let's start with Stoicism. I've definitely heard the phrase Stoic calm before, but what did the Stoics actually believe?
Stoicism was founded by a guy named Zeno of Citium, and they emphasized living in accordance with nature. But for them, nature was basically the same thing as reason and order. They thought that true virtue meant aligning your actions with this rational order of the universe, accepting the things you couldn't control, and focusing on what you could influence through reason and discipline.
So it's not about completely suppressing your emotions, but more about learning to manage them in a wise way.
Exactly. The Stoics knew that emotions were powerful, but they thought your emotions should be guided by reason, not the other way around. This emphasis on self-control and acceptance gave people a way to find inner peace, even when the world around them felt chaotic.
That makes sense. What about Epicureanism, then? It's often associated with pleasure, but I have a feeling there's more to it than that.
Oh, absolutely. Epicureanism was founded by Epicurus, and they also focused on living in harmony with nature. But they thought pleasure was the ultimate good thing. However, they didn't mean just indulging in every fleeting desire.
So it wasn't just straight-up hedonism.
Nope, not at all. For Epicurus, true pleasure meant finding tranquility, a state of being free from pain and fear, especially the fear of death and the fear of the gods. They believed that by sticking to simple pleasures, avoiding excess, and living a life guided by reason and friendship, you could achieve this lasting sense of contentment.
So it's like Stoicism is about finding peace by accepting what you can't change, and Epicureanism is about minimizing pain and making the most of simple pleasures. Two different paths leading to happiness.
You got it. And it's really interesting to see how both Stoicism and Epicureanism, each in their own way, drew inspiration from that core idea of Socrates about virtue and the examined life. They provided people with practical ways to navigate the human experience using reason as a tool to find fulfillment and happiness.
I think it's amazing how these philosophical ideas from ancient Greece are still relevant to us today. We're still asking ourselves the same questions about virtue, happiness, and how to actually live a good life.
And that just shows how powerful philosophy can be. It gives us tools to think critically, to reflect on ourselves, and to make ethical choices. Those skills are just as important now as they were back in Socrates' time.
Socrates' influence goes way beyond these Hellenistic schools, though. His ideas have resonated across centuries, inspiring thinkers from all sorts of backgrounds.
Absolutely. And as we'll see next, his legacy has been interpreted and reinterpreted in so many ways. It really highlights the lasting relevance of his philosophy, even as the world has changed dramatically around it.
Okay, so we've talked about all these different schools of thought that kind of followed in Socrates' footsteps. But let's zoom out for a second and think about his overall impact on Western thought. I mean, he's obviously a huge figure. But how have thinkers, centuries later, really grappled with his legacy?
That's where things get really interesting, because Socrates didn't write any of his own ideas down. His legacy is totally open to interpretation. It's kind of like a philosophical Rorschach test, you know?
Right.
It tells you as much about the person doing the interpreting as it does about Socrates himself.
Oh, I like that. So who are some of these interpreters, and what did they see when they looked at Socrates?
Well, let's start with Hegel. He was a German philosopher who saw Socrates as both a pivotal figure and a tragic one. He admired Socrates' commitment to reason and how he challenged traditional authority.
But you said tragic. Why tragic? I mean, he chose to die for his principles, which seems pretty heroic to me.
Hegel definitely recognized that heroism, but he also saw Socrates' death as a sign of how limited Athenian democracy actually was. Despite all their high-minded ideals, they just weren't ready to deal with the full implications of Socrates' constant questioning.
Ah, so he was kind of ahead of his time then. His focus on individual conscience and reason clashed with the norms of his society and ultimately led to his downfall.
Exactly. Hegel actually drew a parallel between Socrates and Jesus. They both challenged the establishment and emphasized a higher truth, and they were both condemned for it.
But Hegel himself was a Christian, so he also saw a key difference between them.
Right.
I mean, Socrates was just a man while Jesus was divine.
You got it. For Hegel, Socrates' death was a human tragedy, while Jesus' death had this cosmic significance that marked a shift from human reason to divine revelation.
Okay, let's jump ahead a bit now to a very different perspective. Kierkegaard, the father of existentialism, he had a much more positive view of Socrates, right?
Oh, yeah. Definitely Kierkegaard actually saw Socrates as a role model, especially in the way he used irony. They both believed in the power of questioning, provoking people to really confront their own beliefs and make authentic choices.
So for Kierkegaard, it wasn't about finding like a definitive answer. It was more about that journey of self-discovery through questioning.
Exactly. They did have a different view on the nature of truth, though. Unlike Socrates, Kierkegaard believed truth was subjective, personal, something you found through faith, not reason. He thought ultimate truth resided in Christ, not Socrates.
Gotcha. So we have Hegel seeing Socrates as this tragic hero and Kierkegaard seeing him as a philosophical guide. What about Nietzsche? He wasn't exactly a fan of Socrates, was he?
Not even a little bit. Nietzsche actually blamed Socrates for what he saw as the downfall of Western civilization. He thought Socrates' emphasis on reason had basically suppressed our natural instincts and vitality.
Yeah, Nietzsche was all about embracing those primal urges, what he called the Dionysian spirit, as opposed to the Apollonian order that he associated with Socrates.
Right. He felt that Socrates, by putting reason on a pedestal and pushing down those darker impulses, had started this whole trend of over-intellectualism that had weakened Western culture. He even called Socrates decadent.
Wow, that's pretty harsh.
It was a pretty provocative statement, but it shows just how deeply Nietzsche disagreed with what he saw as the stifling influence of rationalism on Western thought.
So we have Socrates as a tragic hero, a philosophical mentor, and even a cultural villain. It's amazing how one guy can spark such wildly different reactions.
It really speaks to how powerful his ideas were and still are. They still challenge us and make us think, forcing us to grapple with those big questions about ourselves and the world around us.
Now, fast forwarding to the 20th century, we have Hannah Arendt. She's known for her work on totalitarianism, and she offered a really unique perspective on Socrates. She was particularly interested in the political implications of his thought.
Yeah, Arendt saw Socrates as a champion of dialogue and plurality. She thought his questioning represented this vital form of political engagement, and she argued that his death was a real turning point, showing how fear and conformity could silence dissent and totally undermine democratic values.
So for Arendt, Socrates wasn't just a philosopher. He was almost like a political activist, engaging in civil disobedience through his constant questioning of authority.
You could definitely say that she saw him as a model for how philosophy can play a critical role in public life, challenging assumptions, encouraging critical thinking, and promoting real civic engagement.
And she really contrasted Socrates with Plato, who she thought retreated from all the complexities of politics and went into this world of abstract ideas.
Yes, Arendt believed that Plato's focus on the world of forms represented a withdrawal from the messy reality of political life, and she saw this trend as something that actually contributed to the rise of totalitarian ideologies.
It's incredible to think that thousands of years later, Socrates is still inspiring these passionate debates and interpretations. He really does transcend time and place.
He really does. And I think that's the key takeaway from our deep dive on Socrates. His legacy isn't about finding all the right answers or settling on one single interpretation. It's about embracing that spirit of inquiry, that relentless pursuit of truth, and having the courage to question everything, even our own deeply held beliefs.
Those are some powerful words to live by. As we wrap up our deep dive into the life and legacy of Socrates, I want to leave you with this. Socrates believed that true knowledge starts with recognizing just how much we don't know. So embrace that spirit of questioning, never stop asking why, and always be open to challenging what you think you know. You never know what you might discover. Thanks for joining us on this philosophical adventure.